Hello chess friends! Today I have a very special chess game for you played by none other than the great physicist Albert Einstein. Now when I first heard that Albert Einstein not only played chess, but that some of those chess games were preserved and I could go check them out, I just had to see him. I had to know what kinds of chess moves would be produced by one of the greatest minds in the history of humankind. Now although Einstein never became a chess master, and he obviously spent a lot more time on theoretical physics than he ever did on chess, I think you can still see his genius coming through in some of these moves, and perhaps a very great unrealized chess potential. Now without much further ado, let's get into the game. This comes from 1933. Albert Einstein has the white pieces, and his fellow physicist colleague Robert Oppenheimer is playing black. I should mention the new format I'm using to try to make things easier to follow. You'll see two chessboards on the screen. The smaller board on the right will contain only the moves of the game. So if you only want to see what these players are playing, look to the right. The bigger board on the left will have all of the alternative variations, or as some of you have been calling them, the what-ifs. So the game is on the right, my analysis is on the left. Let's get into it. Albert Einstein, with the white pieces, starts with the move e4. This is the most popular opening move of all time. It adheres to the three most important chess opening principles. It controls the center. This pawn's hitting a central square. It facilitates piece development, since it opens a diagonal for this bishop. You want to develop your pieces quickly so that you can castle. That's the third principle. Castle quickly and get your king out of danger. So Oppenheimer responds e5, which is good for the same reasons that e4 is good for white. Opens the diagonal for the bishop, controls the center, etc. Einstein responds with knight to f3, taking more central control, attacking the pawn on e5. Oppenheimer defends with knight to c6, developing a piece. Einstein plays bishop to b5, attacking the defender of this pawn while developing another piece and preparing to castle. a6 played by Oppenheimer. Einstein drops the bishop back to a4. Most beginners will learn very quickly that if you take the knight, after black recaptures, if you try to capture this pawn on e5 and win a pawn, black can play queen to d4, attacking both the knight and this pawn, so you're not getting a free pawn out of it. Once you address your knight, which is under attack, black can simply take the pawn on e4, getting the pawn back with a good position. Einstein knows this. He knows his openings. He plays his bishop back to a4. b5 played by Oppenheimer, attacking the bishop, which drops back to b3. Now knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4. Albert Einstein castles, knowing that it's not going to be good for black if that pawn is taken. But Oppenheimer takes the pawn. This is not a popular move. Most amateurs know that when you start taking pawns in the center of the board, when your king is uncastled, particularly a pawn that is on the file of your king, this can be very dangerous. All you're doing is helping open lines for an attack by your opponent on your uncastled king. More popular here would be something like bishop e7 or bishop c5, preparing to get the king out of danger and castle quickly. But after knight takes e4, Einstein plays the strongest move, rook to e1. Immediately placing his rook opposite the black king, while attacking this knight on e4. Oppenheimer defends the knight with d5. If instead he had dropped the knight back to f6, Einstein could immediately regain the pawn that he lost by playing knight takes e5. The white king is still uncastled. There's an attack on this f7 pawn by the knight and the bishop. White has a winning position here, but even stronger than taking that pawn with the knight would be d4. Threatening to take that pawn with a pawn, which would be even better since it would drive this knight away from its nice square where it influences the center. There are several variations that demonstrate why this is such a strong move for white. I'm not going to look at all of them. I'll just give you a sample. First of all, it should be noted that the black pawn cannot take the pawn on d4 because it is pinned to the king. But let's look at e4 if black tries to push forward. White can play knight to e5, attacking f7. There's not a great defense here. If you try d5, blocking the bishop's view of f7, it just loses your knight on c6. So you pretty much have to take that knight out. But here, d takes e5 comes with an attack on the knight, which must move backwards. There's no forward square where it's safe from capture. So it has to go to g8, and now white has a winning move. See if you can find it. The most crushing move here is queen to d5, threatening checkmate on f7, and threatening to take the rook on h8. Black cannot defend against both threats. Always look for moves that threaten two things at once. That is the way most chess games are won. So that's an example of how things can go wrong after the move knight f6. but Oppenheimer defends with d5. It's a stronger move, but still the position is very much in white's favor. Now here Einstein makes an incorrect move. He plays a4. This can be a very good move in this opening, but usually a little later. Einstein's threat here is to take on b5. Let's say black just tries to make a developing move like bishop e7. A takes b5 and wins a pawn because this pawn here is pinned. If you take the pawn, you lose your rook. So that's Einstein's threat. But what's more important is what's going on in the center of the board. A better move for Einstein would have been knight to c3 with a threat to take on d5. Let's say black does something like this. If you take on d5, you're attacking both this knight and this knight here. Black will lose. If you try to take here, this move comes with check. After the check's addressed, we can take this knight. White's going to come out ahead in material in that variation. So let's say black addresses this by capturing the knight on c3. You can take with the pawn. And now both this pawn and this pawn are being attacked with multiple pieces. White has the option to win either pawn. The king is still stuck in the center. This is not good for black. It's worth noting that if you try to push this pawn forward with an attack, this isn't even really an attack because this pawn cannot take this knight, as it would put black in check. So bishop takes d5 could simply be played here with an attack on the knight, and once that's addressed, white could win another pawn and would actually be ahead in material in that situation. So knight c3 would have been the absolute best move here, or even d3 would have been better than the move Einstein played, a4, driving this knight away from the center and then capturing on e5, getting the pawn back. But let me show you what the problem with a4 was. a4 does not address this knight in the center. This knight on e4 needed to be attacked because after what Einstein played a4, Oppenheimer could have played bishop c5 with an attack on f2. Now the normal way to defend this pawn when it's attacked by a knight and a bishop is if you've castled, you can defend it with a rook. And a lot of times this is just fine. But here it doesn't really work out. Black can take the pawn. Okay, he's traded a pawn for the knight, but then he gets a rook, but then white gets a bishop. So white has gotten a knight and a bishop in exchange for his rook and pawn. Materially, that's about even if you count up the value of the material. However, because of the position of white's king, this works out better for black. Black actually has a winning game after e4. This knight now has to move backwards or it will be lost. So let's say you go to g1. Now the black queen can come into the attack. Queen to h4. And if the king moves to f1, you can throw in this queen f4 check, force the king to move again. You can take here on h2. Picking up more pawns, you're attacking this pawn. The position's starting to fall apart for white. Black can castle in one move, and white's the one who has the very exposed king. Back here, if instead you would have moved the king to e2, it's worth noting that this fails to this bishop g4 move. If the king moves, you're going to lose your queen, so you have to put the knight in the way, and then you lose the knight. So this is all very bad for white. But Oppenheimer did not see this move, bishop c5. He was more focused on this less important threat over here by white, and so moves his pawn so that it won't be captured. Now Einstein plays the best move. He plays d3, forcing this knight off of its central square. Here Oppenheimer plays an incorrect move. He plays knight to c5. Looks good on the surface. It's attacking the bishop on b3, but better would have been knight to f6. It's important to add defense to this pawn because what's coming next is knight takes e5. Threatening a discovered check. Now, since this file is almost cleared, anywhere this knight moves, the black king will be in check. So this is a very powerful threat. And black would like to take this knight out. Rook takes e5. Now this is fine for black. This file can be blocked with the bishop, and this pawn has adequate protection. Now let's look at the difference after knight c5. Einstein here plays knight takes e5, again threatening the discovered check. Here, knight takes c6 check would simply win the queen. Here, if you take the knight, rook takes e5. If you try the same thing, bishop e6, blocking the file, here white can actually take on d5. This bishop is not defending d5 because it is pinned to the king. This move comes with an attack on the rook. Of course, if you take the bishop with the queen, you're going to lose the queen. So maybe Oppenheimer saw all this, and he decided to play knight to e7. Now there's no discovered check. This knight on e7 has blocked the file. But Einstein still has a winning position here. He plays a strong move, queen to f3. Threatening queen takes f7, checkmate. Oppenheimer defends with f6, to which white has a very powerful response. But before we see how Einstein responded to this move, let's look at an alternative line, which would have been a little more resilient, bishop to e6, defending f7 with a developing move. Now white does not have any knockout blow here, but can simply develop the pieces, and black is in a predicament. He has no good way to castle his king. Obviously you don't want to castle over here. There's too much open space, too many pawn moves have been made on this side of the board. He would like to castle kingside, but doesn't have a good way to accomplish that. If you play knight g6 to try to open up a diagonal for this bishop so that you can castle, white can simply take on f7. The bishop cannot take, or the king will be in check. And the king cannot take, because the queen is defending the knight, which is forking black's queen and rook. So that is not working. How about g6? Here white has a very strong move. If you can find it, you have very good tactical vision. What is white's best move here? Knight to e4, attacking both this knight and threatening checkmate by knight to f6. This is a move the computer found, and when I saw it I thought, well, what's wrong with just taking out the knight? White has a beautiful response to this move. See if you can find it. Queen takes f7 check. Black's only legal move is to remove the queen with the bishop, after which bishop takes f7 is checkmate. It's a beautiful tactic. So black has no good way to develop this bishop and castle, but this variation would have given black his best chance for survival. Instead, Oppenheimer plays this move f6, which runs into a very common tactic you will see, especially among weaker players, where one player's king is stuck in the middle. Queen to h5 check. Black's only legal move is to put a piece in the way. Oppenheimer plays g6, to which Einstein responds with the only winning move. Knight takes g6 with an attack on the rook. The knight cannot capture the knight, or black will be in check. And if the pawn captures the knight, which is what happened in the game, the queen gets a rook. If instead black had just moved his rook out of danger, well, then there's knight takes e7, discovered check with the queen, so the knight cannot be captured, and there's an attack on the rook. White wins. Back here there was an alternative winning move that was interesting. Back here, instead of queen to h5, knight c6, attacking the queen. Once the queen moves, you can take on e7, bishop takes, and then bishop takes d5, attacking the rook. If you get your rook out of danger, bishop c6 wins the queen. So I thought that was a nice variation. But let's get back to the game. Queen h5, g6 was played. The knight takes, the pawn takes, queen takes h8. So Einstein has won the exchange. He's gotten a rook for his sacrificed knight and has an extra pawn at this point. So materially, Einstein is now winning. Oppenheimer takes the bishop on b3. C takes b3. Then he plays queen to d6, missing a threat that Einstein has. Maybe a little better would be to move this king so that this bishop is not pinned. After queen d6 is played, this bishop is pinned to the black king. It cannot move. So Einstein takes advantage of that, adds an attacking piece. He's now attacking that bishop with two pieces. It's only defended by one. Oppenheimer has no way to add defense to that bishop. This knight can't move, which would add defense by the queen. So he just moves his king out of the way, knowing that this bishop is going to be taken. The bishop takes on f8. Now this knight is pinned. It can't move or black loses the queen. And at this point, Einstein is a full rook up. It's an easy win. Bishop b7 played by Oppenheimer. Now his rook has a view of the white queen if this bishop were to move. But this bishop is not really pinned. Einstein plays queen to g7 here, getting out of the view of the rook. But he could have just played bishop takes e7. And if the rook takes, the bishop takes here. And after king takes, he's still a full rook up. Should be easily winning. But Einstein didn't want to simplify. He had more ambitious plans. So he moves his queen to g7. This knight is now pinned. Cannot move anywhere or the king will be in check. Oppenheimer plays rook to e8, adding defense to that knight. Knight d2 is played, connecting the rooks. It's usually a good thing. c5 played by Oppenheimer. Now here, Einstein plays rook a to d1. Again, he could have simplified the position by taking on e7, and after this big trade of pieces, white is simply a rook up with a very easily winning endgame. But Einstein wanted more. I think it's the sign of a great mind, searching for the strongest and most ideal way to finish off the opponent, sacrificing simplicity for beauty, you could say. Rook a to d1. Oppenheimer falls right into his trap and plays a5. Now see if you can find white's strongest move here. Knight to c4 with an attack on the queen. The queen has no safe square from which it can continue to defend this knight on e7. If the queen moves away from the defense of that knight, it is now defended by only 2 pieces. White will be attacking it with 3. So black will lose that knight and probably get checkmated very quickly. So Oppenheimer simply removes the knight on c4. The problem with that is, after d takes c4, this queen will be lost. It's pinned to the king by this rook. So Oppenheimer takes out the rook. After the rook takes with check, the king moves back. Einstein now grabs another piece. He's now a full queen up, as well as has 2 extra pawns, so Oppenheimer resigns here. Very nice game by Einstein. Many of his moves were the computer's top choice, and almost all of them were winning moves. He only made that one mistake back on move 8, where he played a4, would have allowed bishop to c5 with a nasty attack on f2. So he only failed to see that this knight was actually dangerous and not just a liability. It goes to show how just one move can make a big difference in a chess game. So I hope you enjoyed that video. A chess game played by the great Albert Einstein. Please like and subscribe for more interesting chess videos coming your way soon.